All right, in this section, we're going to talk about something called the Lewis model, or it's also called the two-sector model. Okay, so by Arthur Lewis. And this model is going to tell us about we can separate into two sectors, one called the traditional sector, often which we think of just as agriculture, and the other one is the modern sector, so this will be more industrial type of things. And his idea is that we have surplus labor in the traditional sector. So what do we mean by surplus labor? Well, surplus labor meaning labor that's not producing anything at the margin. It doesn't mean people are not working. It just means there's too much labor in this sector compared to the amount of available productive resources. So what would that look like? So this would be like, if this is the traditional sector, that's the labor going into the traditional sector, and then this is the product. This is how much they're producing, right? This is our production. So then basically his idea was, well, the traditional sector looks like this. So they have reached a level of labor. Let's say we're here right now. They've reached a level of labor that there's too much labor so that the last ones are not able to produce anything. So they're probably working and they're probably actually producing, but in terms of their marginal product, if you took one worker away, nothing would happen to the production. Okay, so that's the idea here. So if you took this one away and you went back to here, nothing happens to production. You took more away, nothing happens to production. We have too many workers compared to, for example, the amount of land that we have available. Okay, so that's the basic starting assumption of this model. And so we're going to turn this into something that can tell us about how the migration from rural to urban can benefit the whole economy. So it can benefit the urban area without hurting the rural area is the basic idea of this model. Okay, so let's go ahead and draw the first traditional sector. So we're going to draw a traditional sector, and we're going to do, I'll have to remind you of a few things probably. So we draw our traditional sector. So here, going this way, it's actually going to be reversed from what you might think. So over here is the marginal value product labor for this. We can call it the traditional sector T, just to keep consistent with what your textbook's doing. Okay, so marginal value product labor, what does that mean? That's the value of the product, how much the marginal worker produces, right? Just to remind you of what this means. This is the value of what the marginal worker produces. That's what that means. And remember, marginal worker, depending on how much econ you've studied, marginal worker is the last worker. Okay, so like if we had 99 worker and we add one more, then the 100th one, that's the marginal. So they're the one at the margin, at the edge. Okay, and this, we're going to reverse our scale. So our labor is going to be going this way. Okay, so labor is going this way. So this is our labor in our traditional sector. Okay, so we're going to be adding more labor going that way, and I'm going to work from this other side. Okay, so here's our basic idea. Our basic idea is that, and let's say these workers are not producing anything, and this is equivalent to the flat spot we saw in the flat spot that we saw in our production function above. And then after we get to a certain point, okay, I'm not corresponding them, but after we get to a certain point right here, then if we take away more workers, we're going to lose production. Okay, so how that corresponds, I didn't correspond the numbers to line them up because I put the scales opposite. But how that works here is then starting from that point, if you take away more workers, you would lose production. So after that point, the workers start to matter. They're no longer very surplus. Okay, and then if we've gone all the way down to here, so this, as we get, sorry about that, as we get sort of like right here, then that corresponds to these workers down here. So they're very valuable. You can see it's very, very steep. those workers are very productive because you have an empty piece of land and no workers. Well, you add some workers, you're going to get a lot more production. So that's why the marginal value of product of labor for them is very high. It's equivalent to this production function up here being very steep. Okay, so the basic idea is these workers over here in this flat part, these are surplus because these ones are surplus because we could take them away and nothing will be lost, just like above. Okay, and then we have to add one more thing to this graph, and the one more thing we're going to add is there's some subsistence wage. So everyone in the rural area, it's not a competitive economy. People work usually in household units and they get paid. They get to share the production, so they don't make that. There's some subsistence wage. Okay, this is to survive. So you earn enough to survive. Okay, so that's our subsistence wage, and then I'm going to draw a little line coming down here. There you go. So that's our idea. Now what we have to do is we have to draw in our modern sector. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and draw in our modern sector at the bottom. The modern sector is going to go the opposite way, because when we take labor out of the rural area, then it goes into the urban area. Okay, so I'm going to start these like this. This is going to, so the end, the green dot is the end of all the workers being in rural. Then we go the other way, then they head towards urban. Okay, so going this way is we got workers in the modern sector. So these are workers in the modern sector. So what's going to happen here? And then let me go ahead and put my subsistence wage on here as well. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so our subsistence wage is here. Okay, so this is our subsistence wage. So as long as the urban area pays, well, technically they would have to pay just above that, but for ease, we're just going to say just the subsistence wage. Then they can get workers. Okay, they could pay slightly above it, but I'm going to ignore that part for now. Okay, so what's going on here? So we have a demand for labor. The demand for labor is based on the current size and capabilities of the urban area. So so we got our demand for labor. Let's say here. This is our current demand for labor. This is based on how productive labor is right now in the urban area based on what they have. And so the urban area will demand a certain amount of labor, called L0. And then, just so you can see the connection, that would mean the rural area would be here. Okay, so these workers right here, I'll erase this, but these workers right here went down there. Okay, they went to work in the urban area. And so then this is the rest of this up here. The rest of this is remaining in the rural area. Okay, and we can see the rural area didn't lose anything because those workers were surplus. They were not needed because there wasn't enough land, for example, to go around in the rural areas. So then what happens next? Well, the capitalists get profit because the workers are producing this much on the purple line, but they only cost this much, the subsistence wage. So this is all profits for the capitalists. And so what do they do with these profits? Well, hopefully they don't go hide them in the Bahamas somewhere. If this country is growing, what they do with the profits, they invest. So the profits of the capitalists gets to expanding the firms, new capital, and then this increased their demand for labor in the formal sector. That's the basic idea. And so this shifts out, and now we got more demand for labor. So this is the marginal value product of labor at the next one. Okay, and so this shifts out, and since they're still able to find the workers from this informal sector, since the surplus has not been used up yet, they can still hire, so they're not raising the wages. So this partially explains why often at the beginning part of development in a country, the workers may not see huge gains, but the people who are running the companies The capitalists are going to see big profits, but the people actually working in the companies, their wages may not grow much over a period of time. So, for example, in the 1990s, the wages for factory workers in China were not changing very much, and it's partly because there was so much labor that could follow them. So there was plenty of supply of workers to meet the demand, right? And so wages didn't rise very much. So then they get more profits, right? And then they reinvest them again. So this is the idea. This continues until we reach a certain point. And let's define that point right now. So to define that point, I need to bring my line down from the top. Okay, so I need to bring this line down. And so this point is when the labor demand hits this point. Okay, so this is our new labor demand, so they reinvest it again. And when we hit here, after this point, something's going to change. Okay, so up to this point, they could get as much labor as they needed. They could get as much labor as they needed for the same wage, even if you might think of this as being slightly higher than the actual subsistence. The labor supply was flat, but after this point, if they want to hire more workers, they're going to have to pay them more. So labor supply becomes upward sloping, and you're going to start seeing wages rise. Okay, so let me try to explain quickly why that happens. So that happens because after this point, when the workers leave the farm, they cost the farm production. And they cost production that's more than what they're going to gain in the city, right? If they were to be paid that flat subsistence wage. And so they're going to need to be compensated more in order to attract them to leave. Otherwise, it would be better off for them to stay in the rural areas where they could actually gain more. So what's going to happen? So after this, this point right here is known as the Lewis turning point. After Lewis turning point, surplus labor in the rural areas has been used up, and after that, we will start to see wages growing in the urban sector, because people will need to be compensated more in order to attract them to come, partly because enough of them have left the rural areas that labor is starting to get scarce. So in this case, there's no more surplus labor in this economy. Labor is getting scarce in the urban areas, and labor is also getting scarce in the rural areas. So if we see, for example, here, let's suppose they eventually expand the demand for labor way out here, then they would have to pay a wage up here. Okay, they're going to have to pay this wage way out here in order to attract those workers. So the wages will start rising, and if they want to expand more, they're going to have to pay more. Okay, so we kind of get this idea that there's this period of time when you have a surplus of rural workers, and they can migrate, and they boost the urban area without hurting the rural area. But then at some point, when this surplus, when this surplus dries up, then once the surplus dries up, then there's a cost, and then the wages start to rise in the urban area. Okay, so the Lewis turning point, after this point, urban wages must rise. Modern sector wages, let's say, modern sector wages must rise. Compensate for lost productivity in the rural areas. And I'll talk a little bit more in the written text about this. Okay. And we'll also talk a little bit I'll talk about it a little bit in the writing about whether or not this is true that there's a surplus. Several researchers have taken strong opposition to this idea that there ever was a surplus, especially in areas that have plenty of land. That it's unclear that there actually was a surplus in the rural areas given the technology they had for farming. Okay, and so it may be that this part has some doubts, which we'll discuss later.